If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The Pacific in mid-1944 was a wide, colorless stretch of heat and silence. It didn't move unless the wind made it, and even then the movement felt tired. USS Marlin slid through it just below the surface, engines humming low, every vibration echoing off steel. Inside, it smelled of oil, metal, sweat, and coffee, an airless world that never stopped working. 50 men moved in practiced rhythm, shoulders brushing pipes, voices low, every order acknowledged with a nod or a whisper. Lieutenant Grace Halley sat at a narrow desk beside the radio shack, headphones pressed over her ears. The equipment hissed and popped, Japanese code groups blending into static. She had learned to filter the noise, to wait for that clean pattern that marked a real transmission. Her fingers moved over the typewriter keys, sharp clacks cutting through the background hum. She didn't look up. It was easier not to. The last time she'd been on a ship, the deck had split beneath her feet. The sound of metal tearing still replayed when the submarine's hull groaned under pressure. Grace was an intelligence officer attached to Pacific Fleet Radio Analysis, temporarily assigned to Marlin to verify enemy transmission chains. On paper, she was there to track convoy radio patterns. In truth, her superiors had sent her to get her strength back, to work without thinking about the men who hadn't made it out of the water. The burn scars along her right arm were mostly healed, but her sleep hadn't caught up. The submarine's constant vibration filled the silence that her thoughts otherwise would. Captain Daniel Reeves stood at the attack periscope, his posture square, his jaw locked in habitual restraint. He was in his late 30s, lean, with the look of a man who had forgotten what sunlight felt like. His crew called him the cargo killer, a nickname born from reports that listed his name beside tonnage sunk. He never repeated it. Reeves was efficient, exact, and dry in manner, but behind that discipline lived the fatigue of someone who had seen too much luck and too many bodies on the surface afterward. His orders were precise, spoken without urgency or emotion, the voice of a man who had built a wall around himself and learned to live behind it. At 0530 hours, sonar reported multiple contacts bearing northeast. Engine signature steady, screw count matching a large Japanese convoy. The operator looked toward Reeves. "Sir, it sounds heavy. Cargo class, at least 8 ships for escorts." Reeves didn't hesitate. "Plot intercept course. Depth to 60 feet. Rig for silent running." The crew moved at once. Lights shifted to red. Valves closed with padded grips. The submarine tilted, descending in slow motion. Grace felt her stomach tighten as the hull adjusted to the change in pressure. She checked the clock, logged the order, and set her fingers back on the typewriter. As Marlin settled into attack depth, Reeves moved to the chart table. "Their zig pattern's predictable," he murmured to the exec. "They'll turn west again in 20 minutes. We'll slide inside the curve." His tone stayed calm, but the tension in his neck betrayed focus sharp enough to cut through the hum of machinery. Grace kept listening to the frequencies. The Japanese escort transmissions were irregular, too frequent, too confident. They didn't know Marlin was there yet. She jotted down frequency changes and handed the slip to the captain. Their fingers brushed. His skin was cold. "Good work, Lieutenant," he said quietly, his eyes still on the chart. "Keep it tight." "Yes, sir." Minutes passed with only the sonar ping tapping through the stillness. Grace tried not to think about the last time she'd waited for an impact. She remembered the way her previous ship had jolted when the torpedo struck, the deafening rush of water, and the screaming of metal giving way. She forced the image down, pressing her palm flat against the desk to steady it. Reeves' reflection in the periscope glass caught her attention, his expression unreadable, except for the faint muscle twitch near his jawline. He was holding his fear the same way she was, buried under control. "A periscope," he said. The lens broke the surface. He rotated slowly. "Convoy in sight. Range 12,000 yards. 2 columns, escorts at the rear." He lowered the scope and turned to his fire control officer. "We'll close to 6,000. Make ready tubes 1 through 4. The boat turned, silent and deliberate. Pumps shifted weight. Every man on board knew his task. When Reeves gave the final order, fire 1, the releases cut the silence cleanly. Seconds stretched into small eternities. The explosion came dull and heavy through the hull. One ship hit a cargo carrier, bow lifting before dropping out of sight. The crew didn't cheer. The sonar man simply reported, "Hit confirmed." Reeves' hand rested on the periscope handle. His breathing didn't change. "Reload," he said. "We're staying with them." Grace looked down at her log sheet and wrote 0539 hours, first hit confirmed. Her hands trembled briefly, then steadied. She wanted to feel relief, maybe pride, but all she felt was the same dull ache she had carried since her last ship went under. People were dying above them again, and she didn't know how to feel about being alive when others weren't. An hour later, the first depth charges fell. The sound rolled through the sub like thunder trapped in a box. The lights flickered. Dust fell from a pipe. Men tightened their grips on the railings. Reeves stood unmoving, watching the depth gauge as if it were the only thing that mattered. Grace flinched at the first concussion, but kept typing, marking time intervals automatically. Each impact made her chest tighten, yet she focused on the rhythm of her work. She understood now why she had been sent here, to see if she could hold her composure again under pressure. The answer wasn't clear yet, but when she glanced toward Reeves and caught his calm gaze returning to her for just a second, something steadied in her chest. If he wasn't breaking, neither would she. When the barrage ended, the captain finally exhaled, a small sound that barely carried through the control room. "All compartments report," he said. "All secure," the chief answered. Reeves nodded once. "Good. We're not done yet." The submarine leveled out. The men eased into routine again, but no one spoke above a whisper. Grace wiped a streak of oil from her sleeve, rolled a fresh sheet into the typewriter, and began another page. Reeves stood by the periscope, eyes fixed forward, already planning the next move. Both knew they had only started the day, and somewhere beneath the weight of duty and silence, an understanding began to take root, wordless, necessary, and real. The next morning came without sunlight. Inside Marlin, time was measured by duty rotations and the changing pitch of the engines, not by sky or horizon. The air felt heavier than before, warmer, with the staleness of 50 men breathing the same air too long. The crew worked in silence, conserving oxygen and energy, moving with a kind of mechanical grace. No one asked what the next move was. They already knew. The convoy was still out there, and Captain Reeves wasn't finished. Reeves stood near the chart table, unshaven, eyes red but sharp. He had barely slept. The map in front of him was covered in pencil marks. Angles, bearings, predicted turns. The Japanese ships were running patterns he had seen before. He knew the lead merchant would shift 5 degrees west after 2 hours, opening a narrow window where Marlin could slip inside the screen and fire again. It was the kind of opening only experience taught you to see. Grace Halley sat at her post, copying intercepted signals into her log. Her right hand ached from typing, but she ignored it. The sound of her keys was steady, familiar, controlled. She caught herself glancing toward Reeves now and then, studying the way he watched the sonar man's report with stillness that wasn't calm, but concentration disguised as calm. She recognized it. It was the same stillness she had used to survive her last sinking. The same quiet fight to keep fear buried under duty. At 0715, sonar picked up fresh screws. Multiple contacts closing. Same convoy, same course, the operator said. Reeves turned toward the periscope well. "All right, we finished this." He didn't raise his voice. He never did. The men didn't need inspiration. They needed certainty, and he gave them that with every controlled movement. Grace felt her pulse climb as the submarine angled into position. She thought about asking him how close they were planning to get, but the question died in her throat. You didn't interrupt silence when silence meant survival. The periscope went up. Reeves took a quick look. 3 tankers, 2 freighters, and 4 destroyers. Heavier escort this time. The exec frowned. They'll be on edge after yesterday. "They're guessing," Reeves replied. "They think we'll come from the east. We'll come from below." He stepped down, eyes sweeping across the crew. "Make ready tubes 1 through 6. Fire on my command." Grace felt her chest tighten again. She told herself it wasn't fear, just anticipation, but the difference was small. The last operation she'd been part of had ended in chaos, fire, and screams. This one felt different, controlled, deliberate. Reeves wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing precision. Still, she couldn't shake the thought that one wrong move could turn all of them into another silent wreck on the seafloor. When the first torpedo fired, the boat vibrated like a struck drum. She watched the second, then the third, the timing exact. Reeves counted seconds in his head, his hand tapping against the periscope handle. The explosion came, one, then another, clean, hollow booms through the hull. The sonar operator nodded. 2 hits confirmed. Third one missed, impact late. "Reload," Reeves said calmly. "Let's make it 3. Depth charges followed minutes later, closer this time. The sound was heavy and punishing, shaking dust from the ceiling. Grace pressed her back against the bulkhead, eyes closed, counting seconds. She tried not to think about drowning, the cold water closing over her head as it had a year ago. She forced her breathing slow. Across the room, Reeves stood firm, one hand gripping the periscope column. He didn't flinch. His voice stayed even, each order as measured as if they were in a classroom instead of a combat dive. That steadiness spread through the crew. If the captain wasn't afraid, they wouldn't be either. When the last charge faded, Reeves moved to the sonar station. "Report. Convoy scattered, sir. Escorts searching wide. We're clear on the south end." He nodded once. "Then we stay close to the stragglers. They'll fall behind." Grace caught herself watching him again. His calm wasn't arrogance. It was exhaustion worn into habit. She could see the fine tremor in his left hand when he reached for the chart. Not fear, just strain. She wondered how many nights he'd spent under this same pressure, counting every man lost because of his success. By evening, Marlin had struck again. 2 more ships went down, explosions lighting the water above in brief, orange flashes that flickered through the periscope lens. The control room filled with the smell of burnt insulation and sweat, but no one spoke. Every man knew they had made history. 5 ships in less than 12 hours, but the mood wasn't triumph. It was fatigue and disbelief, the realization that even victories down here sounded like destruction. Grace typed her report without looking up. Her fingers trembled slightly from the adrenaline that hadn't worn off. Reeves stood near the helm, arms crossed, studying the gauges. He said quietly, "We'll make the next one before dawn. Then we're done." She didn't ask how he could be sure. Somehow, she believed him. Later, when most of the crew had rotated off duty, the hum of the sub settled into a low, constant pulse. Grace remained at her desk, sorting her papers, when she heard soft steps behind her. Reeves stopped beside the radio compartment, glancing at the coded slips she'd pinned to the board. "You did well today," he said. She nodded but didn't smile. "We all did." He hesitated before speaking again. "How are you holding up?" The question caught her off guard. For a moment, she couldn't answer. "Better than last time," she said finally. Reeves looked at her, and in that look there was a kind of understanding that came only from people who had already lost too much. "That's all any of us can do," he said quietly, then turned away. When he left, Grace sat back, staring at the paper in front of her. The typewriter ribbon had run dry on the last line. She replaced it slowly, hand steady now. The fear was still there, but so was control. She could live with that. The submarine kept moving through the dark, chasing what was left of the convoy. Above them, the sea hid the wreckage of the ships they'd destroyed. Below, inside the steel hull, 2 people who barely spoke were beginning to understand each other in ways words couldn't reach. And somewhere between the constant hum of the engines and the heartbeat of the ocean pressing around them, the line between duty and survival grew thin, but neither of them was ready to stop yet. The sea was black and still when Marlin surfaced again after midnight. A thin line of moonlight ran across the waves, glinting on the periscope housing and the wet steel of the conning tower. The men on the bridge spoke in short bursts, simple direct sentences about bearings, wind, and distance. They had been submerged nearly 20 hours, hunted, shaken, and deafened by explosions. Now, they could finally breathe air that wasn't thick with sweat and oil. Captain Daniel Reeves climbed the narrow ladder to the bridge, the cold night air striking his face like a slap. He didn't flinch. He'd gone longer without sleep before. Behind him, Grace Halley emerged carefully, holding the edge of the hatch. Her hair, usually pinned tight, was loose at the edges, damp from the humidity inside the boat. She squinted at the horizon and drew her coat closer. The radar operator reported faint echoes, 3 returns moving slow and broken. Stragglers, Reeves muttered. Probably damaged ships trying to make a home. Grace watched his face as he studied the faint light of the horizon through binoculars. He looked older in the moonlight. The deep lines around his mouth and eyes had settled into something permanent. She wondered when he had last ridden home, if he had anyone to write to. It was the kind of question no one asked on a submarine. Down below, the crew prepared the forward torpedo room. The men moved like they had rehearsed it for years. Calm, methodical, not wasting breath. They didn't need orders shouted. Reeves' quiet confidence had become its own command language. Even the youngest sailor understood that noise meant death. Grace followed him to the navigation table inside the conning tower. "Captain," she said softly, "the intercepts from earlier. One of the escorts broke formation and stopped sending. I think they've lost coordination." He turned to her. "You're sure?" "Yes, sir. The traffic gap's consistent. That means there's an opening on their western flank." He gave a brief nod. "That's where we'll go." She didn't say it aloud, but she understood what that meant. They have to surface for the attack. The last time she'd been topside during combat, she'd been pulled out of burning water. She kept her voice steady anyway. "Acknowledged." By 0200, Marlin closed to within 4,000 yards of the last freighter. The convoy was barely moving, one tanker listing, the other dead in the water. Only a single escort circled nearby, its searchlight sweeping the sea in nervous arcs. Reeves ordered battle surface. Pumps hummed, ballast shifted. The submarine rose, breaking through the surface with a slow, deliberate hiss. The crew manned the deck gun without a word. Reeves stepped out into the open, coat whipping in the wind, his face pale in the moonlight. Grace followed, standing behind the periscope housing where she could see without getting in the way. She'd never seen him on the surface during combat. He looked sharper, more alive, but also distant, as if he existed only in this narrow slice of danger. "Target bearing WW2," the gunner called. "Range?" Reeves asked. 3,000 yards and closing. "Open fire." The first shell left the barrel with a flat, gut-deep crack. It hit near the stern of the freighter, throwing up a plume of flame and debris. The second shot followed, then a third. Grace flinched at each blast, not from fear but from the memory it carried. Every explosion was another ship going under. Men trapped below decks, fire eating the sky. She forced herself to keep her eyes open. The escort turned toward them, its searchlight cutting through the night. And for a moment, Grace thought she saw her death coming again. Reeves didn't move. He called adjustments with calm precision. The gunners shifted aim, and within seconds, the enemy ship went dark. Whether hit or fleeing, no one could tell. The freighter burned bright enough to paint the waves in orange. Reeves stood watching until the hull began to list, and only then did he lower his binoculars. "Cease fire," he said quietly. "That's enough." The gun crew hesitated, unsure if they'd heard him right. He repeated, "Cease fire." The words carried finality. The deck went silent except for the crackle of distant fire. Reeves turned to Grace. "Log the time and position," he said. She nodded, fingers shaking slightly as she wrote. 0247 hours. Seventh ship confirmed. He watched her for a moment, his face unreadable. "You all right, Lieutenant?" "I am," she answered, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "I just keep wondering how many men were on that freighter." Reeves's eyes lingered on the burning wreck. "Too many," he said quietly. Then he looked back at her. "That's what I think every time." The word surprised her. She hadn't expected honesty from him, Not here, not in the middle of war. But it made sense. His calm wasn't indifference. It was how he carried the weight of what he'd done. It was how he survived. As they slipped back below the surface, Grace returned to the radio room. The typewriter waited where she'd left it. Her reflection on the metal casing looked foreign, pale, tired, but alive. She typed the report in short, clean lines. No emotion, no opinion, just the facts. But when she reached the last sentence, her hand stopped. For a long moment, she stared at the paper. Then, with quiet precision, she added one final line. Captain Reeves remained composed under fire. Crew morale stable. Mission ongoing. She hesitated before typing her own name at the bottom, as required. Something about putting it there, signing her existence to an event that had cost so many others theirs, felt heavier than she expected. Later, she found Reeves alone in the control room, standing by the periscope, watching the faint light of dawn filter through the lens. The crew slept in shifts, the submarine running silent again. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "Command will call this a record patrol," he said. "They should," Grace replied quietly. 7 ships in one day. He turned then, his eyes shadowed. "That's the problem," he said. "They'll count the ships. They won't count the people." Grace didn't answer. There was nothing to say that would change it. She stepped closer, standing beside him. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was honest. It was the only way they knew how to live with what they'd done. Outside, the ocean began to glow faintly with the coming sun. For the first time since she'd come aboard, Grace felt something like steadiness. Not comfort, not peace, but the certainty that she belonged here, doing what she could with what was left of her courage. Marlin turned north, its engines low and steady. Above the surface, wreckage drifted in long, quiet trails. Below, inside that narrow steel world, 2 people, bound by duty, haunted by what they'd survived, found themselves facing the same truth. Victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. And for now, that was enough. The sky above Marlin was gray when dawn finally came. The surface looked calm, but the stillness meant nothing. It only hid the storm waiting beneath. Reeves ordered a dive before the sun fully broke the horizon. The submarine sank smoothly, water rushing past the hull until the sound faded into the steady hum of the engines and the creak of metal under pressure. Every man on board knew what came next: retaliation. Japanese destroyers were closing in fast. The convoy they had shattered was broadcasting distress signals, and within an hour, the sonar began picking up multiple high-speed contacts. The tone in the operator's voice was tight, controlled. "Screws approaching fast, sir. At least 4. Reeves didn't hesitate. "Take her down to 280 feet. Rig for silent running." The order passed through the boat like a whisper. Lights dimmed to red again. Footsteps softened, and the men moved as though sound itself could kill them. Grace Halley stayed by her post, head bent close to her typewriter, but she wasn't typing now. There was nothing to record except survival. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. Each groan of the hull made her stomach tighten. She remembered the same sound before her last ship went down. The slow bending of steel right before it tore apart. She tried to push the memory away, but it came back in flashes: smoke, fire, the freezing shock of water. Her breath quickened until she forced herself to look toward Reeves. He stood near the periscope column, one hand braced on the steel, the other steady on the depth gauge. His jaw was locked, his eyes fixed, but his breathing was even. Seeing that steadiness helped her find her own. The first depth charge dropped without warning. The blast slammed through the sub like a hammer. The lights flickered and loose bolts rattled in their mouths. The men said nothing. Another charge followed, closer this time. Then 2 more in quick succession. The noise was deafening. Grace gripped the edge of her desk. She caught herself counting the seconds between impacts. 10, 11, then another explosion rolled through, shaking the deck plates. Her palms were slick with sweat. She wanted to close her eyes, but she forced herself not to. Reeves had said once, "A commander never looks away from the fight, even when he can't see it." She wasn't a commander, but she understood what he meant. The chief's voice came low from the control room. Pressure holding. All compartments sealed. Reeves nodded slightly. Maintain depth. We'll wait them out. The next pattern came closer still. Dust drifted from the overhead pipes like snow. A valve near the aft bulkhead hissed under strain, and a thin spray of water leaked through the seam. A young seaman scrambled with a wrench to tighten it. Gray saw the boy's hands shaking, no older than 20. Reeves stepped closer, knelt beside him, and helped tighten the fitting with calm precision. Easy. Don't force it, he said quietly. The boy swallowed, nodded, and the leak sealed. Reeves gave his shoulder a quick pat before standing. That moment, quiet, human, broke through the tension for a breath. Grace felt it too. It wasn't heroism. It was leadership that kept fear from spreading. The charges stopped for a few minutes. The silence afterward was worse. Every man waited for the next impact. Grace's mind wandered briefly to her life before this. The calm of an office in San Francisco, code books stacked neatly, the smell of coffee and ink instead of diesel and metal. She wondered if that version of herself still existed. A sudden blast threw her back into the present. The submarine lurched violently. Books fell from the shelf, one striking the deck with a hollow thud. The sound made her flinch hard enough that Reeves noticed. He turned his head slightly toward her. "You all right, Lieutenant?" She took a second to answer. "Yes, sir." "You sure?" Grace forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'm still here." He gave the smallest nod. "That's what matters." Another series of charges came, farther away this time. The sonar operator whispered, "They're widening their pattern, sir. Must think we turned south." "Good," Reeves said. "Hold course. Don't make a sound." Minutes turned into an hour. The pressure on the hull creaked like a low groan in the distance. Grace began to realize what separated Reeves from the commanders she'd seen break down before. It wasn't courage. It was acceptance. He didn't fight fear. He carried it like another piece of equipment, just there, handled, part of the job. Finally, the sonar went quiet. The screws faded. The destroyers had moved on. Reeves waited another 10 minutes before speaking. "All right, bring her up to periscope depth." The submarine slowly rose through layers of dark water until the world lightened to a cold gray. Reeves raised the periscope and scanned the surface. "No ships in sight," he said. "We're clear." The crew exhaled collectively, tension releasing like air from a valve. Someone laughed softly, the sound nervous but real. Reeves didn't stop him. He just leaned on the periscope, eyes half closed. The fatigue hit him all at once, the kind that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from weeks of holding everything together. Grace stood, stretching her legs. Her knees were weak, but she didn't care. She stepped toward Reeves. "We made it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, voice low, "but they'll be back." "Then we'll be ready," she replied. He gave a faint smile, tired but genuine, and nodded. "That's the right answer." The two of them stood there in the red light of the control room while the sub rose to safer depth. Around them, the men resumed their work, resetting gauges, checking lines, cleaning up what had fallen. The boat had survived the worst the enemy could throw. Hours later, Marlin surfaced again under a pale sun. The ocean was calm and empty, no enemy ships in sight. Reeves climbed out to the bridge and let the wind hit him. Grace joined him, her uniform streaked with oil and her hair falling loose. The sea stretched in every direction, endless and indifferent, but it didn't feel hostile anymore. It just existed. Reeves looked toward the horizon. "You did well down there," he said quietly. Grace shook her head. "I was scared the whole time." "So was everyone else," he said. "The trick is to keep moving anyway." She studied him for a moment. "You've done this before. How do you keep from losing yourself in it?" He didn't answer right away. "You don't," he said finally. "You just make peace with the part that's already gone." It wasn't a comforting answer, but it was honest. And honesty was all they had left after what they'd seen. The sea breeze carried the smell of oil and salt. The horizon shimmered faintly with sunlight. Marlin turned west, heading for deep water again. Grace took one last look at the calm surface before going below. She didn't feel relief. Not exactly, but she felt capable. For the first time since her last ship sank, she believed she could face the next day. Below deck, the men joked softly, the way sailors did after surviving what should have killed them. Reeves stayed silent, eyes on the ocean. He knew the patrol wasn't over yet. There were still miles to go, still reports to file, still ghosts to carry. But for now, Marlin was alive, his crew was safe, and the mission, whatever it had cost, was still intact. And somewhere deep in that quiet, between the hum of engines and the steady roll of the sea, the weight they carried began to feel a little lighter. By the time Marlin reached Pearl Harbor, the salt had baked into the paint along her hull, and every man aboard had the look of someone who had spent too long in darkness. The Pacific was calm on that morning in August 1944, too calm for what the crew carried with them. 7 ships sunk, a convoy destroyed, and yet no one celebrated when the band started playing on the pier. Reeves stood at the top of the gangway, his cap tucked under his arm, eyes fixed on the crowd waiting below. He didn't smile. Neither did Grace. They disembarked in quiet order, the sound of boots on metal echoing like a slow drumbeat. Officers from command shook Reeves's hand, congratulated him for the record-breaking patrol, spoke of citations and medals. He nodded politely, offered the practiced answers of a man who understood duty but not glory. Behind him, the crew moved off toward debriefing, shoulders slumped but spirits steady. They were alive, and that was enough. Grace walked beside Reeves, keeping her posture formal, but her thoughts were tangled. This was supposed to be her recovery assignment, 2 weeks of observation, routine code work, then reassignment to an office job in intelligence. Instead, it had become something else entirely, a test of her endurance, her ability to face the same sea that had once nearly taken her life. She'd proven herself, but it hadn't given her the comfort she'd expected. The sea didn't forgive. It only gave second chances to those too stubborn to quit. Inside the debriefing room, the air smelled of coffee, sweat, and the faint hint of oil that clung to their clothes. The intelligence board questioned them for hours. Ranges, attack angles, torpedo counts, confirmed hits. Reeves answered without hesitation, his tone steady, his memory sharp. When they asked about the presence of a non-combat intelligence officer on the patrol, he spoke carefully. Lieutenant Halley provided accurate signal analysis that allowed us to predict escort patterns. Without her intercepts, we wouldn't have achieved the results we did. It wasn't a performance. He meant every word, and Grace knew it. Still, she didn't look up from her papers. Praise in a war report was a strange kind of burden. It bound you to what you'd done, good or bad. When the meeting ended, the reviewing officer, a graying captain with calm eyes, leaned back in his chair. "Captain Reeves," he said, "you've broken every patrol record in this theater. Command wants to pull you stateside for training duty. You've earned a shore post." Reeves paused. "You mean they want me off the line?" "Call it what you will," the captain said. "You've done your part. Time to teach others how to do theirs." Reeves nodded once. "Understood." Then the officer turned to Grace. "Lieutenant Halley, you're being transferred to Fleet Radio Intelligence, Honolulu Station. Effective immediately. They'll need your field experience." Grace didn't argue. A part of her had expected it. Another part felt strangely hollow at the thought of leaving the sub. The constant hum, the closeness, the silent routine that had become her rhythm. It had nearly killed her, but it had also reminded her what it meant to belong to something. That night, after the paperwork was done, she walked down to the docks alone. Marlin sat still in the moonlight, stripped of her war paint, her deck glistening with salt. The smell of diesel hung in the air. Reeves was there, leaning on the rail, sleeves rolled up, the usual hardness in his face softened by exhaustion. "You planning to sneak off without saying goodbye?" he asked quietly. She smiled faintly. "I was hoping to avoid a scene." He chuckled under his breath. "Not much of a scene, just the two of us." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you ever think about what comes next? After all this?" He took his time before answering. "I used to. Not anymore. The sea has a way of making the future small. You start thinking one patrol at a time, then one day at a time. Anything more than that feels like a lie." Grace stepped closer, resting her hands on the cold steel of the railing. "You don't have to stay in the war forever, Daniel." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He looked at her then, eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of the harbor lights. "Maybe not, but I'm not sure who I am without it." She understood that too well. The sea had taken so much from both of them that they had begun to define themselves by what they'd lost. But something in his voice, quiet, uncertain, told her he wanted to find out. They stood in silence for a while, watching the ripples on the water. Then Reeves said, "I'm heading to Mare Island next month. Training command. They'll let me stay on land for once. And you'll hate every minute of it," she said with a faint smile. "Probably." He turned toward her. "What about you?" "Fleet intelligence will keep you busy." "Busy is good," she said. "It means I won't have time to remember." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal pin, the submarine warfare insignia from his uniform. "Take this," he said, holding it out. "For the next time someone questions why you were there." She looked at it, then at him. "I didn't earn this." "Yes, you did." His tone was firm, final. "You stayed." She took it carefully, closing her hand around it. "Thank you. Just promise me one thing," he said. "When this is over, don't disappear into another room full of static." "You meant for more than code and paper." Grace met his eyes, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of water against the hull and the soft hum of the harbor. "Then promise me you'll stop measuring your worth by the ships you sink." Reeves gave a faint smile. "Deal." 2 months later, they met again in Honolulu. She'd been working long hours in the decoding section. He had just arrived to instruct new sub crews. He found her one evening at a small cafe near the docks, still in uniform, still with that same calm presence she carried even when tired. They talked for hours about nothing, about everything, until the noise of the city faded around them. By winter, they were married in a quiet ceremony at the base chapel. A few of Marlin's old crew attended, standing in pressed blues, their faces lit with pride rather than sorrow. Reeves wore his new insignia, but no medals. Grace carried no bouquet, only a folded piece of paper, a page from her old patrol log, the one she had typed during the 7th ship's sinking. Afterward, they walked along the harbor in silence. The air was warm, the sea calm again. For the first time in years, neither of them felt haunted by what lay beneath it. They didn't talk about the past anymore. They didn't need to. Reeves found peace in teaching younger sailors how to survive what he had barely lived through. Grace built a new communications network that saved crews she would never meet. They had both learned the same lesson, carved into them by the ocean, that endurance was its own form of victory, and that love, when found in silence, could be stronger than any war. Years later, when they looked back on that patrol, the one that made headlines, the one the Navy called historic, they never spoke of the numbers or the record. They remembered only the quiet moments between depth charges, the brief glance in red light, the unspoken promise that had begun deep under the Pacific and lasted the rest of their lives. The war ended, the ocean stayed, and in the calm that followed, Daniel Reeves and Grace Halley finally learned what survival was really for. Not just to keep breathing, but to keep living. And they did together.